So, Your Excellencies, business leaders out there, officials, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, I want to say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whoever you are. It's really a pleasure to have so many of you from all corners of the globe today. We are talking, after all, on a very important and timely topic of COVID-19. In our country, there's been quite a number of discussions over the health impacts, but we have not done much on the economic impact. So this is a very much welcome and timely conversation we'll be having. So given the current conditions, we are not able to meet in person, as you all know. So this is a new format, and as a new format, there will be new rules of engagement. So here's what we have planned for you today. It's going to be relatively short and to the point. 60 minutes is what we have planned, but we might go a few minutes over. And in addition to Zoom, you can follow on the YouTube channel. So the conversation will be live streamed through the YouTube channel. And we will be having the recording available on that as well. Okay. And so we'll have a couple of rounds of interventions with our distinguished panelists, and then we'll follow on with some questions. I have a few questions, but I'm going to limit them because there's so many demands coming from our audience. We will try to answer as many questions as possible given the time boundary. And if there are any, if we have time, I'll try to take some live questions as well, but I can't make any promises. We want the conversation to reach far and wide, so I'm asking everyone to use the hashtag ET Policy Forum, hashtag ET Policy Forum, when you're quoting any one of our distinguished panelists. So let's see if we can make it a trend. My name is Heno Kasafa. I'm the managing partner at Precise Consult, and Precise Consult is an Ethiopia-based economic development and business advisory firm. I would like to also acknowledge our partners, Flawless Events, 251 Communications, and Gazebo International, who collaborated with us to bring you this conversation today. I couldn't ask for a better panel for the topic today, and I would like to just go through our panelists very quickly. They're all very well-known and distinguished gentlemen and lady. His Excellency, Dr. Eyob Takalin is the State Minister of Finance, and he's been spearheading Ethiopia's economic policy response to the challenges of COVID, and he's the right person for us to have here for this conversation. His Excellency, Dr. Ephraim Lemango, he is now the commissioner of the recently created Jobs Creation Commission, a very important commission looking to increase jobs, but then given the current conditions, probably playing defense, and his commission has gone out to do some work looking at the impacts. We'll hear from him. Ms. Brahani Demse is the managing director of CFA's Capital, so straightforward private sector, financial sector, but also having a very good sense for what's going on in the private sector. So we have very good representative there. And CFA's Capital, if some of you have not seen it, has published a very good piece on the economic impacts of the virus on the Ethiopian economy. I definitely recommend you download and read that. And last but not least, we have Abeba Amro Selassie, who is the director of the Africa Department at the IMF. Again, an Ethiopian serving at the continental level and able to bring us sort of wider views, continental and global views from a global practitioner point of view. So let me start from the global perspective. Abeba, I'm going to pick on you now. So as we all know, COVID-19 is essentially a health crisis. However, to deal with that crisis, all of our countries have been forced to shut down the economy. People moving from India, basically shutting down 1.3 billion people to the United States, and even now Ethiopia declaring state of emergency. So economies are being shut, and the impact on the global economy, I'm afraid, is going to be quite large and possibly unprecedented in our lifetimes. Could you just take 5 minutes then to give us your overall assessment of the situation at the global and continental level, and maybe what that might mean for Ethiopia as well? And if I may add one more to that, what would you recommend would be the framework the Ethiopian government should think about going about to tackle this overall challenge? Over to you.
Thank you, Enoch. Thank you for the invitation and thank you for these questions. Very important and profound questions. Let me start by acknowledging the point you made, that this really is a once in 100-year type of crisis, something that will really shift the paradigm, the global paradigm, this whole globalization era that we've been dealing with. And even though we are hoping, at least in terms of the impact on economic output, this will be relatively short-lived and we will hope to see a recovery going forward, there are some other aspects which will be much longer lasting. So we have to use this moment to really, really think deeply about how we position ourselves as individuals, as societies, as businesses, as countries. So that's kind of the broader context. Zooming in terms of what the economic interplay between the health aspect and the economic aspect has been. This is not your traditional crisis. It starts out with a health crisis, and of course, the first thing we have to worry about is making sure that people are protected, healths are saved, and we support everybody whose incomes are being impacted by the downturn. But the traditional economic medicines also that we would use are not necessarily ones that are going to work as effectively this time. Just to give one example. When an economy is in a crisis, when demand slumps, when you have supply disruptions, often you can have the government stepping in and injecting demand, injecting liquidity into the economy to get things going. In this crisis, we're actually wanting people to stay home. We want people to not go out and be pursuing their active daily lives. So even the traditional policy levers we have are not necessarily going to be ones that will work as effectively. So again, it requires fairly deep thinking in terms of how to support our economies, how to support people. What is for sure certain is that the global economy is going to be in recession this year. Many countries are going to be facing the deepest economic downturns that they have in 100 years or so. So that is playing out in country after country where COVID has taken hold, but even in those where the disease has not spread as much, but have been taking active measures to try and contain and mitigate the effects of the disease. More importantly, in terms of developing countries, there are a couple of other additional factors that are at work. First and foremost, of course, is that you have societies, you have people who have to be daily economically active to earn a livelihood, and you're asking these people to stay at home. So we're tremendously worried about the implications for poverty, for people are already on edge, being pushed over with lasting consequences. So in developing countries, countries like ours, this is a very, very important consequence that we have to deal with. And then globally also, at a more macro level, we've seen a significant outflow of capital from countries, or a delay in inflows that were expected. So that's something that, again, will complicate policy making. In terms of what we can do, first and foremost, this is a health crisis, so the focus has to be on doing whatever it takes to get the crisis behind us. So increasing health spending will be a very important aspect of that. Second, also important will be to look at ways in which we can support people's incomes. One thing that is problematic in a lot of African countries, of course, is that you don't have existing social safety networks. You don't have the kind of automatic stabilizers by way of social security payment, unemployment benefits that would kick in. So creative ways need to be found to provide support directly to people, whether it's food handouts, people paying electricity bills and the like, maybe foregoing electricity payments to small and medium scale enterprises, maybe targeted tax holidays. So a lot of creative thinking is needed in terms of how we can support people and households whose livelihoods are being impacted. So those two, I think, are the immediate policy response. In terms of more macroeconomic policy response and aggregates, I mean, we've been making the point that, notwithstanding the fiscal constraints, notwithstanding the debt considerations, this is a time to allow automatic stabilizers to operate. So, the tax decline that many countries are going to be seeing as a result of economic activity being shut down should be accommodated in wider fiscal deficits. Financing is a constraint, of course, and this is where the fund is trying to step in to provide as much financing as we have ever in our history to the region in as rapidly as possible time to countries. And, it's not just us, but other institutions like the World Bank also are stepping up to provide a lot of the financing countries will need at this period of time. So let me stop here unless you have any specific point you want me to make.
Yeah, I think let me come back to you on the follow-up questions and rope in His Excellency Dr. Rio. So you heard Abebe speaking about the pandemic and the economic impacts of it and the kind of issues we should be thinking. What are you thinking on behalf of the Ethiopian government? What is your, I know the government has been meeting with different groups that are impacted by the crisis and the economic groups that are driving growth and job creation. What are you hearing on the ground? What is your general assessment of the situation? And what is the general direction the Ethiopian government is planning to move ahead in terms of coping and hopefully rebounding quickly? So over to you.
Thank you so much, Henok. I guess Abebe has laid out the global overview and the impact this pandemic is having on African economies. And clearly, Ethiopia is no exception. Maybe one thing I want to add is that, as one prominent economist recently said, we all are guessing the impact of this pandemic on economies. There is a lot of uncertainty. There is a lot of what happens tomorrow. There is this wait and see mode. But in our case, what we've tried to do is, as much as possible, try and understand the impact of this. First and foremost, clearly, it's a health pandemic, so making sure people are safe. As you've seen, I don't think the cabinet, the minister has been as busy as we have been over the last couple of weeks and months, making sure people are safe, making sure that the pandemic would have minimal impact as much as possible. And so that's the most important priority in that regard. I think responding to the health needs, making sure the Ministry of Health has everything at its disposal is something that the government has been doing. But equally, this is also an economic crisis. So the first effect of the crisis came in with our relationship with the rest of the world. Clearly, as trade volumes have plummeted around the world, we've felt the impact already. The most important, I think, limitation is on people to travel around the world, and that has impacted the hospitality industry heavily. And our airlines, as you know, is one of the biggest airlines in the world, has gone through a lot of difficult times, thrived, but this one is really tough. Recently, as the airlines has reported, more than 500 million losses in just the last few months. And the numbers are counting by the day as cancellations increase. So in that conversation you mentioned with key stakeholders, what we tried to do is to sort of understand how they are faring with this global crisis. And we found very, very valuable inputs. I think the most humbling one is this sense of solidarity. I think businesses were saying these are difficult times, but it will come to pass. And we have to show a concerted effort to make sure livelihoods are protected, and we have the right preservation strategy, to sort of rebound as quickly as possible. And we found that to be in line with the government's thinking. So in that regard, our first response was to support sectors that were heavily hit: hospitality industry, the export industry, both agriculture and manufacturing exports. As you know, industrial parks are not exporting at all. Flour, for instance, which was, destined to bring in about 400 million USD this year, an amazing growth trajectory over the last couple of months, is now facing serious setback globally. So we've responded to those first set of hardly hit sectors. But as Abe was mentioning early on, I think this is going to affect everything as we know it. The people are at home now. Domestic activities have slowed down. And the most hit sector is the service sector. As you walk around Addis, you see that most bars, restaurants are even when they are allowed to open, are empty. People are now walking into those. So our focus is now, how do we support these MSMEs, these small businesses? How do we make sure people would fare through these difficult times? In Ethiopia's context, we have significant amount of vulnerable population. As you know, about 8.5 million people are on safety nets. But now, because of this crisis, the number of people that would be put in a very precarious situation has significantly increased. I know Ephraim is on this panel. He can mention, Dr. Ephraim can mention the job loss. But as a government, what we're trying to do is make sure people can eat and stay at home during these difficult times. That is the most important response. But we are doing this by having our eyes on the recovery plan. Whatever we do should be commensurate with the impact of the crisis on industries, on firms, on households. But also our measures should have a recovery plan embodied within the first set of measures. So broadly, we're trying to mitigate the crisis and trying to sort of preserve businesses, livelihoods, but also looking at recovery plans so that we can quickly rebound and continue our path to prosperity.
Excellent. Thank you, Excellency. I'm going to come back to you and Abebe on a bit more statistical-oriented questions, and maybe even thinking about the informal sector, people living on daily labor, the people that are off the radar, and perhaps this is even a better question for Dr. Ephraim, who would understand this a bit better. In our country's history, the private sector, as a formal private sector job creating, has not been that big for a very long time, but his commission and under the Prime Minister's office has been doing a lot of work to get the private sector to grow and create jobs so that you have formal private sector jobs. But for now, we have very large portions of the economy, large numbers of people living on informal day-to-day activities. It's really a big question on how to understand what the situation is out there and how we might be able to respond. So I'll come back to you on that, but then let me jump off to Dr. Ephraim. Excellency, if you could simply tell us, you've done a fantastic first round assessment of the impact of the COVID and health and economic crisis on the Ethiopian economy and on the job creation or losses. And then you have also come up with some very interesting possible policy directions that might be adopted. So if you could take 5 or 6 minutes and tell us the key points of that study, that would be fantastic. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Enoch. Thank you for this very important panel that so far we have been heavily talking about the health impact of COVID, but I think there is a considerable impact on the economy and jobs and incomes of individuals. And happy to share the findings of our analysis that are done within the Jobs Creation Commission. I think few preface to this conversation is that it's important to understand economic shocks caused by COVID have different pathways to impact both incomes and jobs. Primarily, obviously, there is a health and medical shock that is going to result into increase in expenditure of the government, given that the government is the major funder of the health sector, that is directly at ameliorating morbidities and mortalities that are associated with the spread of the virus. That will likely require additional budget and expenditure for medical supplies and required health system expenditures. But the second and most important thing, which comes as a trade-off to containing the spread of the virus, is obviously we are taking measures such as social distancing measures. And at the same time, in addition to social distancing, there are several containment measures that could range from a primordial level of physical distancing up to a level of a draconian level where everyone is asked to sit at home. I think in Ethiopia, we're eyeing somewhere in the middle, or perhaps a little lenient sort of current containment measures. This will definitely have an impact in consumption levels and, of course, expenditures made by each and every household. But the containment and self-distancing, and particularly social distancing measures, are also compounded by the global measures taken by many of our trading partners, who we do export and import, and many of our trading interventions as well. And of course, the third and most important pathway is that people are likely to have that feeling of wait and see in such times of uncertainty, because we definitely know that we are in uncharted territories and in extraordinary times, which will require extraordinary measures. So there is this tendency of people to limit investment because there are several uncertainties that you would want to be sure. So we have looked into what are the likely job impacts in the service sector, manufacturing, construction, looking into both self-employment, which is much more within the informal economy, and at the same time, the wage employment as well. We have also tried to look into what are the possible, even though most people think these are far-fetched impacts, to look into what would happen even in the agriculture sector, which is in the further rural area. So our analysis shows, given the granular impacts of the tourism and hospitality industry that we have witnessed over the last 2 months period, where there is a considerable decrease of tourist activities that has impacted many of our starred hotels, both in Addis Ababa and also other major cities, which definitely shows you many of them are between 5 to 10 occupancy rate, and those restaurants associated with such touristic and local activities are also facing the brunt of the challenge. And the fact that many of our exports are also to Asia, Europe, and the US and the Middle East, and these countries and continents are also taking such drastic measures of limiting movements and social distancing, and also many of them closing their borders, is likely also to impact the jobs that are likely to be heavily reliant on imports and exports. And we have witnessed that in many of our industrial parks, which these days are compelled to think other measures of coping with the current challenge, because they could not really send their textile products. As we have seen, the apparel industry, the demand is particularly the offline demand for the apparel industry products has considerably decreased. Recently, we have also seen exports to Europe of floriculture, particularly the flower industry, which employs more than 100,000 people, is also considerably affected. Construction, we know it's an area which is where there is huge investment by the government in Ethiopia, but it's also important to keep in mind, medium and small level construction activities are heavily financed by the private sector, and that are likely to be impacted by the wait and see behavior of people not to spend, not to invest with whatever amount of money they have. So we have seen within the service sector, we expect about 300,000 jobs, close to that with our medium level estimate, are threatened. And together, manufacturing and construction are estimated about, we estimated about 1.1 million jobs are threatened within manufacturing and construction. So altogether, we are eyeing in our medium level estimates, it's about 1.4 million jobs might be threatened over the next 3 months period, given that there are also uncertainties about the duration of this pandemic and our ability as a nation to contain it over the next few months. This will definitely impact how long the economic impact would linger over the next few months. So altogether, a very conservative estimate of around 700 to 800,000 jobs being threatened, and a medium level estimate of about 1.4 million jobs being threatened, and a high level estimate, especially in the worst case scenario where every measure that we take locally could have a complete lockdown, and also then the spread of the virus increasing over the next few weeks, that is likely to result in about close to 2 million jobs being threatened over the next 3 months period. This can change day by day, because there is so much uncertainty in terms of the data, what is happening within the global economy, and whatever measures we are going to take over the next few weeks will determine what is likely to come. If it continues, 6 months, up to 6 months, or even beyond, the impact will likely double, if not increase more than that. But we are eyeing the next 6 months to be the period where there is likely to be a great contraction of the economy and the jobs lost. But at the same time, we're hoping there will be a revival period that would definitely require considerable number of employers and firms to be able to also engage in the process of making sure there is a program where there is, go back to work sort of program in the revival process. We considerably believe that it's important to support firms in a way of making sure that they retain their employees. And this supports could range from direct credit availability by the banks up to a level of postponing debt payments. And also there are a few measures that are currently under discussion, which perhaps a little bit Dr. Eob can share a bit, but additional measures, including ways of waiving taxations and related modalities to be able to support other government as part of the global solidarity movement. And at the same time, to be able to support our businesses to remain. For jobs to remain and for those threatened jobs not to be lost, it's important that we support micro, small and medium enterprises, but at the same time, larger enterprises who are heavily in service sector and manufacturing sector, who are currently employing considerable number of people. In general, I think it's important to also see that close to 1.9 million people within the urban economy are self-employed, which are heavily in the informal economy. So that these are people like street vendors, service providers, who their livelihood depends on a daily level of income. So any disruption to that income would likely push these people into poverty. So the need to address the needs of the self-employed people who will be affected by any sort of social distancing measure or any sort of lockdown measure, that will require us to also further expand our safety net program, which currently has about close to 8.5 million people in rural areas, but at the same time, close to 600,000 people in urban areas. So those people who go to poverty are likely to require support through safety net programs, at least to support their livelihood. Finally, I think agriculture is also an area, even though might likely be impacted at a later stage, it is heavily, if there is an impact in agriculture, it is mainly through the spread of the virus within the rural part of the country, which might definitely affect the possibility of many of our farmers to operate, particularly in the planting season, the upcoming planting season in a month plus period. But also the lack of inputs, now that there is a global supply chain red tapes everywhere, here and there, which is likely to slow the delivery of inputs such as fertilizers. So agriculture might be affected given there are no adequate fertilizers and inputs supplied ready for the planting season. Over.
Thanks so much, Dr. Ephraim. I think your brief intervention right there just put a lot of numbers to the picture. I mean, to give a better picture for what we're facing. No matter how tame the virus is spread may seem to us at this point, even at the low or medium level impact, the economy is going to suffer quite a bit, and then livelihoods are going to suffer quite a bit. I mean, we're talking about over 1 million jobs possibly. And then it's really good to know that you have all the numbers figured out, even on the informal sector. That's very, very promising, I would say. I'll come back to you with some more questions. I think I might forego my chance and go to the audience because everybody's asking so many questions. Let me go to Berhane, last but not least, representing private sector voice here. Your firm, CVS Capital, has done that fantastic study also. And I think some of the findings and recommendations are similar to what the Jobs Commission study has done so in some aspects. Could you also give us, in 5 or 6 minutes, the main points of your findings, where we expect the biggest challenges? You might agree or disagree on the JCC's assessment also, but then some of your recommendations that are in the report talking about how Ethiopia should move forward. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Henok, for having me in this webinar. So as earlier mentioned by Dr. Eob, there are many aspects that the world does not fully understand about the pandemic, how long it will last, and its long-term impact. So our report was therefore focused on what we know today and its impacts on the basis of a set of specific assumptions that we had. So to summarize our analysis, I'll do it in two parts. The first one is highlighting the underlying assumptions of the report. And second, the sector-specific and macro impacts that we've highlighted in the report. So our basic assumption is that the impact will be more severe for the last quarter of this Ethiopian fiscal year, April to June 2020, followed by 6 months of gradual domestic and global recovery, which means July to December 2020. So in addition, we assume that only 4 economic subsectors will face the most of the impacts and costs, these being hospitality, exports, some manufacturing, and banks. Note that in our report, the agricultural sector, which is the largest contributor to the Ethiopian economy, is not assumed to be disrupted in this fiscal year to June 2020. And we also did not assume construction activity is much affected in the same last quarter period, being the second largest share of the GDP. So what are the impacts highlighted in our report? Looking at the 4 most affected sectors, the first one, as I mentioned, is hospitality industry. And if you include the tourism, it represents about 5% of Ethiopia's GDP, is facing an almost complete loss of customers with near empty hotels, restaurants, and tourist sites experiencing major cancellation for the next 3 to 6 months. The next subsector we took into consideration is the exporters, which represent about 2.8% of Ethiopia's GDP. They have seen a significant decline in exports. And as mentioned earlier by Dr. Ephraim, the flour exporters are threatened by several quarters of near zero revenue, which translates to around 110 million loss per quarter, depending how long the conditions in Europe, which is our primary market, take to recover. In addition, as mentioned earlier as well, the textile sector is seeing suspension of orders from big US and European companies, and potentially this could translate to a loss of $50 million per quarter in terms of revenue. The third subsector we took into consideration is the manufacturing sector that represents 4% of Ethiopia's GDP. Those that are dependent on foreign inputs are reporting delays in getting critical inputs, machineries, raw materials, or accessories. For example, imports from China represents 26% of Ethiopia's total imports. This, together with availability of FX, could significantly reduce their operations for several quarters unless the Chinese recovery continues to pick up. The fourth sector we took into consideration are banks. Banks are already facing very tight liquidity conditions, even before the corona crisis. And now they are threatened by a potential jump in non-performing loans as businesses become unable to service their loan repayments, worsening their liquidity positions. So based on these 4 sectors, the report estimates that a figure of around 15 to 20,000 firms could be affected, and between 750,000 and 1.5 million jobs could potentially be threatened, which is the same figure or similar figure to what Dr. Ephraim just highlighted. So considering the number of jobs threatened, not all will be at job loss risks, but we estimate that this translates to around 27 to 57 billion in wage income being threatened, which is about 1 or 2% of Ethiopia's GDP. Looking at the macro impacts, generally we think the balance of payments impacts are more severe than the growth impacts. Growth, this year our fiscal year end is coming up to June, so we think only this quarter will be impacted. We've seen strong performance in the first half of the year. So because of that, considering 1 quarter of GDP performance, the actual performance impact will be limited to about 1%. But there will be a lag, and the big impact will be in the next fiscal year, starting July for Ethiopia, which we forecast that will reduce from 7.5%, the forecasted figure, to 5% based on our basic assumptions highlighted earlier. Of course, if the virus spread then becomes worse and in the country, then will threaten broader segments of the economy, bringing markedly different social and economic consequences than we highlight in our report. On balance of payments, the report estimates that Ethiopia could lose potentially up to $1.5 billion up to fiscal year 2021 due to declines in exports, remittances, service earnings such as Ethiopian Airlines, and slower FDI inflows. This account, for example, the offsetting impacts that we have included into this, which is like imports tend to fall in line with reduced consumer demand, lower manufacturing, and also due to the much lower oil prices. I think all these impact offsets the balance of payments. So based on our estimate, the 1.5 billion is the net impact that we see on balance of payments. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Burhani, for that fantastic intervention. I think we've gotten a good sense for what to expect. It's actually quite impressive, the amount of data and analysis that's now being available, both from the government and the private sector side. A lot of the questions that are coming have the sense of what are we doing about it? So notwithstanding some of the directions His Excellency Dr. Ephraim has already started talking about, maybe we can go around and start talking about what can we do about it. The Ethiopian government has already started responding to the economic impacts, but some would make the argument that the fiscal space is not necessarily there. Like most of the African countries, we have some limitations in terms of what we can act upon. So it's going to require some creativity. So let me go back to Abebe. And so what is the IMF doing about this as a global entity responsible for helping to create a sound economic system around the world, or a financial system around the world? What are the measures the IMF is taking, and what can we expect from the IMF in terms of support to Ethiopia? Also, so I'm going to start piling on people's questions as I go as well. People seem to also be concerned that, I think Ato Tamrat was the question from, was concerned that countries are starting to act on their own accord now, looking after their own nations, and supporting each other seems to be coming down. So what are the chances that countries in Africa, and Ethiopia specifically, can expect support from the West? All the promises that the IMF and World Bank and other donors have committed to, what are the chances that they will renege or delay those commitments? So this is a question to you, Abebe, and partly to you, Excellency Dr. Eyob, as well. Over.
Thank you, Henok. So, in terms of the policy response that's required and the advice we've been giving, I laid out a little bit earlier what we think is the right way to proceed. And really, as I said, just to very quickly, points touched on also by Dr. Ephraim and Dr. Eyob. This is a health crisis. This is a threat to people's livelihoods, and those have to be the priority. And fiscal policy, monetary policy have to do what is feasible to try and protect those as much as practicable, as much as financing will allow. And we're not just saying that, but also putting resources behind it. So with almost every, we have so far in just sub-Saharan Africa, 32 requests for financing, which we are processing extremely quickly. And in the same vein, we will be providing support for Ethiopia, and very shortly. So we're discussing under discussion. Now, you highlighted the fact that the policy responses in sub-Saharan Africa, in really many parts of the developing world, will be constrained by the fact that going into this crisis, there were existing vulnerabilities on the health sector, of course, health systems being weak and the like, but also on the fiscal side, governments having elevated debt levels, governments having elevated fiscal deficits already. So when this crisis hits, it complicates the policy response. Our view remains that notwithstanding these constraints, notwithstanding these considerations, at least in the near term, the right thing to do is allow fiscal deficits to widen. Issues like debt sustainability are more of a medium-term issue, and we really cannot ascertain that until we have a clearer picture of what the recovery is going to look like. So in the near term, you have a lot of countries that are going to be in a gray zone about whether the future of public finances is healthy or drastic adjustment is going to be needed going forward. That we can come to once the crisis is behind us. The right thing to do right now is to support economies, to support livelihoods, to get this crisis behind us. If this crisis is not behind us, as a former colleague has said, we will have more than debt sustainability issues to worry about. So the right thing to do is really deal with the pandemic. You also raised a question about the concerns that this has raised about how countries are interacting with each other, threats to globalization, multilateralism. In some cases, we've seen hoarding of certain items. As I said, frankly, we've been trying to make the case that COVID, this awful disease, doesn't care whether you're in Addis, Nairobi, or Bangui, or Paris. It is a global pandemic, and unless you address it everywhere, it's going to persist. It's going to come back and haunt other countries, as we've already seen in many cases. So this is why also, I think the international community really has stepped up to provide us with additional capacity, additional firepower to be supportive at this time. So do not underestimate how much support there has been from the international financial community to ensure that we could respond very rapidly within the fund. We've done quite a lot of reforms to, for example, double the amount of resources we can quickly give to countries with no programs attached. So there is quite a lot of momentum. Will it persist? Will it last? Question mark. Let's see. But I think the immediate response has been to allow us to move forward as quickly as possible. One last point I want to make. The reason why the international community also needs to step in to offset some of the hits to the balance of payments that Brahani highlighted is exactly to stop liquidity issues, which is the case in many cases, the liquidity challenges becoming solvency issues. So if you allow companies, if you allow countries that are facing these temporary liquidity challenges to slump into recession, to slump into severe economic difficulties, then you aggravate the global economic situation, you aggravate social conditions, first and foremost, of course. So it's also in the interest of the international community to provide temporary financing, temporary support to allow countries to exit from this without lasting damage. So all of this motivates us, and we really, I don't think in the institution's history have worked as rapidly, as fast, and are making available as big resources. So we're trying to do whatever we can.
Thank you, Abab. I think it's quite interesting when the IMF makes such kind of recommendations. I think we have to pay attention even more. This is somewhat contrary to what we normally hear from the IMF, which usually recommends discipline in fiscal matters, very much so, to watch inflation, to watch debts. So it's kind of refreshing, but it's also scary.
Two things. One, as my boss says, this is not your grandfather's IMF. And then second, really, it really speaks to the enormity of this crisis that we are facing, and it's across the board. No country is going to be spared. And unless we work with each other, and of course, institutions like the IMF are exactly there for that, to provide the liquidity that sovereigns in distress face, then there's no way out of this. So the enormity of the crisis, but also I think we're a different institution than our public image often portrays.
Okay, so I'm going to lose you in about 15 minutes. So let me ask you a follow-on question maybe. So we're all focused on, admittedly and rightly, on the negative impacts. Are there any positive impacts? Are there any opportunities within this crisis that we are not paying attention to, we should be taking advantage of?
So, I think first and foremost, awful as it is, I really strongly believe in Africa's and our country's best years are ahead of us. So I'm, the dynamism that we have in our region, the young population that we have, the smarts that we have, really will all allow us, I think, to have a better future. The key issue is like how to get to that quicker than would otherwise be the case in the face of this, awful shock. The fact that we have, if you will, we're at early stages of development of things like our telecom sector, even financial sector, I think will help us do this fabled leapfrogging that we're talking about. And it's amazing how in the context of crisis, we're finding new ways of working with each other, including this discussion that we're having, of course. I've been incredibly amazed at how much work we could do without being at the office also in our case. So I think these things are going to be creating new ways of doing work. I think some aspects of what the crisis has brought about will have really long tails. So getting used to working in this virtual format will be one, but also demand will be shifting perhaps from some activities some traditional activities to newer forms of activities. The agility of the private sector in particular, the agility of government in facilitating that, recognizing that, and will be really an important part of how we exit this crisis. So I think one way to think about also in terms of government interventions that are being done is to make sure that they're temporary rather than permanent ones. And the reason for that is to make sure that we don't sustain activities that would otherwise, that otherwise would face difficulties going forward, and are using resources, limited as they will always be, to support new thriving sectors. And also, maybe this is also an opportunity to do reforms that we've been thinking about but haven't quite arrived at. There's a lot of ideas coming across Africa beyond indeed about structural reforms that could be pursued that would facilitate more flexible working arrangements. All of those, I think this is a good time to think and put in place the frameworks for.
Thank you, Baba. If you have to go, we'll give you permission to just say bye and leave. I don't want to hold you. I know you have to go to another meeting at 10 o'clock your time, 4 o'clock our time. So thank you for giving us your time and your insights, and hopefully we can have you over for more conversations like this now that we're working in the digital economy. And one of the things that we're hearing is the post-COVID world is going to be more digital, and it's a lot of the questions I'm hearing here as well. And if Dr. Eyob or Dr. Ephraim want to pick it up as well, because all the IT practitioners are talking about how Ethiopia is far behind, and this could be an opportunity also to jumpstart that economy, to create jobs and empower growth as well. So it's definitely a very interesting time. It's very difficult to think about positive things, but as they say, never let a good crisis, never waste a good crisis, as they say. So while we're dealing with the negatives, I think we should focus on the positives as well. So thank you, Baba.
Thank you.
So let me go to His Excellency Dr. Eyob now, and so
if I may, I will head out. Huh?
Okay. Thank you, Baba.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you again for the invitation.
I see. So you've heard, I think you've heard, you had your assessments, and we've also heard from the rest of our panelists on, even with specific numbers, what the crisis is likely to mean. As you rightly said, nobody really knows for sure. So how are you responding? You've started already. People are wondering two specific things. First, how is all of this going to affect the government's homegrown economic reform agenda? How is this impacting your timing? How is this impacting the government's plan to act on the privatization? All of these things are being impacted. So that's the first question. How is this being impacted? And then the second question, and again, I'm summarizing a lot of people's question here. Second question is, what interventions, follow-on interventions? It's good that the government has started, but given the scale of the job losses and the scale of impact to businesses, what follow-on responses can we expect from the government supporting SMEs, supporting companies to keep their employees, and some of the sectors that are critical for Ethiopia's growth and job creation, but also foreign currency attraction. So let me throw that back at you, and we might have more questions. So I hope you guys will have a few more minutes after 4 p.m.
Thank you so much, Henok. I think those are very important questions. Before I get to that, let me just comment on a point Ababa mentioned earlier on, that IMF is not our grandfather's IMF. And we've really seen that when we have developed our homegrown economic reform program and asked for support. In all honesty, as someone who was involved in the entire process, I was surprised at how they've come around. So truly, there is some change there in terms of encouraging local ownership. Now, again, on that point of global response, as you know, Prime Minister is spearheading efforts across Africa, mobilizing support from all over the world. So as of now, we don't really undermine the very encouraging response that is coming, despite countries sort of looking internally and trying to do it solo, but at least at the global level through global institutions, the response has been encouraging, and we hope it will continue to be the same. On the reform, well, Henok, I don't think this pandemic cannot come at any worse time than this, to be honest, because look at what we've managed to achieve over the last couple of years. This country is transforming meaningfully in all fronts. On the economic front, we have had a looming financial and economic crisis. We've come out of that. And on our homegrown economic reform, we have achieved significant results on the macro-financial, ensuring macro-financial stability, showing a credible path to the distortion in the forex market, the shift to the private sector, the rebalancing. The credit to the private sector has increased by 85% over the last quarter alone. And also in the sectors, in some key sectors, the amount of transformation we've seen is phenomenal. Agriculture, a sector that we've not touched at all, is now really a promising and a flourishing sector. Our lowlands are put to farming, significant productivity increments in highlands. Tourism, a sector that we've sort of neglected for a while, kind of hiding our tourism treasures, is reviving. Look at what is happening at Ntoto. I mean, the mountain that you've been seeing all your life, Tohenok, is now turning into an attractive tourism site. But this is just a sign of what is happening across the country. I was in Koisha the last couple of weeks looking at one completely different source of growth, or in parts of Oromia, as you know, an industrial export processing zone is going to be established, which means another Dubai is in the making here in the neighborhood, close to Addis. So while we're working on these transformative reforms, we have really seen this major setback because of the coronavirus. So yeah, it would impact some of our activities. And that is why, as I said earlier on, we can't afford to sort of leave a lasting shock onto the economy, because we have too much to lose if we do that. So in that regard, our focus is entirely on mitigating the impact of the pandemic by keeping people safe. but equally importantly, preserving livelihoods, and preserving firms' activities is important. That is why the first set of economic measures was to inject liquidity through private banks. Why? Firms that have faced a shock can now go to their banks, get some debt relief, some debt rescheduling, and also additional access to finance when they need to pay their employees. So the overall, maybe if I can put it this way, the overall focus of the government is how we make sure there is a shared responsibility across every individual, every firm, and then as a government. I mean, this is not the US. I mean, you can't go to the Congress with a $2 trillion stimulus package and send checks across individuals. But there are things that we can do. We can definitely map out the most vulnerable group. And I think the most ambitious mapping we've done. Now, in all parts of Addis, every neighborhood, every block has been mapped out. And we know who are people that are highly vulnerable, people that have had different livelihoods that is dependent on their daily movement. And a master plan has been developed on how we respond to this, on how we make sure people can eat and live, sustain their lives. But also for SMEs, as Dr. Efrem was alluding to, we're looking at a comprehensive package. How do we make sure we can preserve firms as well? Because if they die, then the recovery will be much, much longer. So in that regard, the focus areas is, again, how do we share their costs when they want to keep their employees and when they want to sustain their businesses. In that regard, what is in the making is additional liquidity injection, some sort of cost sharing on employees' salaries, probably sheds. As you know, these small firms rent sheds with a significant amount of cost, and supporting them for a couple of months could probably help them live through this difficult time and then rebound in the course of a few months. Now, what is our assumption here? What we are assuming is this epidemic will be short-lived. The concerted effort that we are making in minimizing the health impact would work because we cannot really afford something that lingers on for months or for a year. This is not the kind of economy that can sustain that. So having a short, effective intervention, and the state of emergency has that in mind, whereby we can make sure the health response is more coordinated, more unified, that health extension workers can go to the village, to the households level, and check if this pandemic has gone to the village level, because that's very important. For now, we're only relying on tracing that came from abroad or that showed a sign of illness, but now we need to go in a mass testing scale in the next couple of months so that we can know how to respond to this. But we're very optimistic that a rebound is in the making. It would require tough choices. For instance, the modeling we've done to look at the future impact of this crisis is worrisome. Unless we make the right kind of investment, this could be a damaging impact for a year or two. But you can reverse this. How do you reverse this? You completely change your priorities. Immediately as we get out of this crisis, you invest in important productivity sectors, but also while you respond to the crisis, you make sure core productive activities are intact. For instance, agriculture, a little bit different viewpoint from Dr. Efrem. The whole strategy is to make sure that sector is intact. How do we do that? We try and keep the pandemic from going to the rural areas, but also the kind of farming activity we have, fortunately, is smallholder farming, so people can still keep social distancing, make all precautions, but be productive. We cannot afford to sort of put everything on hold for a long period of time. And as a Minister of Finance, definitely our next year's budget is going to be completely different. We have to make sure we fill the investment gap so that we don't go into a low level of disequilibrium, so that we can quickly rebound. So our view is even in the first quarter of next year, a little bit different from Brane's projection, a rebound can be in the making even during the first quarter. A small rebound because of the nature of our economy. We have significant amount of informal sector. Agriculture is the mainstay, as you know, but even in construction, in service areas, a big chunk of it is government-led construction. Some camps are still intact with the right kind of protective measure. They are still engaged in activities. So the rebound can be much quicker. So I just want to end by a message of optimism. I think to your question earlier, what this pandemic has taught us, and for me personally, my trust in humanity has significantly increased. I think as human beings, we've come to see that this is not the time of individualism. This is not a time of shortcuts. It's a time of solidarity, a time of collective survival. And we've seen that in action. And really, we're very, very grateful for the kind of response we've seen across the community, across the private sector. And if this continues, if you share the burden and then quickly come back to the rebound of the economic activity, this should be a short-lived crisis, but that would leave us, I think, a significant lesson as a society.
Thank you. I think it's good to stay positive as well, and I do tend to agree with you. I think we're starting the good side of a lot of people. We're seeing from citizens to businesses, everybody starting to chip in. So the optimism also includes that the impact is not going to be all that much on your timelines, on privatization and the economic reform agenda. Could we assume that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think on the privatization and the reform agenda, this is continuing unabated. Every activity is ongoing. You would expect some sort of delays. For instance, say we issue the tender on the privatization. People might have difficulty traveling the next couple of months. So you need to accommodate for that. But for things that we can do, for instance, on licensing of Ethio Telecom, there will be a virtual discussion on the directives in the next couple of weeks. So things that we continue to do, because we know this is a short-lived thing. We're looking beyond the crisis, but it would affect the timeline a little bit. It depends on how the next couple of weeks will tell us on the epidemiological findings, on whether the virus has spread beyond what we know now, or whether it hasn't.
Okay, good. One question I want to ask you, I may not get any more chances, and this is coming from our audience. There's over 108 questions being asked right now. And obviously, a lot of them are similar, so I'm trying to bunch them, but I found this one to be important. We also received a number of questions pre-event, by the way, and one of them talks about being able to operate nationally. So there seems to be a disorganized response to the crisis. So in some countries, for example, there's been licenses or certificates being provided to essential deliveries of, say, food, like supermarkets or food products of other kind. And within our case, some of these companies that are sending these questions as saying that there is no clear coordinated approach to this. So within each region, approaches are differing from one to the other, and it's causing a lot of confusion on the side of the business. Is there anything being done to coordinate the responses of the regions on a national level?
That's a very good question. I'm glad you asked that, Enoch. Absolutely, we've heard these comments from a variety of people, and the government is responding to this. As we speak, a nationwide protocol is being, in fact, has been developed, is being discussed on how the supply chain can be managed, on how movements between regions would be, movements of people across the nation and even within cities. But that coordinated, unified approach is important. And in fact, the main rationale for the state of emergency is to make sure this is coordinated across the nation. Yes, I think we've found that to be a significant shortcoming, and it's being corrected. And this will be communicated very widely in the next couple of days.
Thank you, Excellency. I'm going to move on to His Excellency Dr. Ephraim too. And I think similarly down those lines, specifically talking about jobs, but also support to businesses. Now, very close to the private sector, so I hear lots of challenges. You know, the last couple of years have been sort of tough on the private sector, even before the COVID crisis has emerged. As you know, even though we were, as Dr. Eyob was mentioning, we were moving away from some of those serious challenges and finding some solutions. Businesses are facing a number of challenges: liquidity crisis, inflation is relatively high, foreign currency, all of these things. And then you hear lots of businesses also complaining about very tough tax collection year that has taken its toll, lots of audits, which basically means big payments coming, 5 years worth of a correction happening on businesses. So of course, every business has to pay taxes, otherwise we don't have a budget to operate in. But all of these, and on top of that, now we're seeing the impact of the COVID crisis happening. So down that line, I mean, what are some of the thoughts that you might want to add on top of Dr. Eyob's interventions, and what we must do, what the JCC is planning to do as well? Over to you.
Thank you, Enoch. I think it's very important for all of us to understand there are key issues that will need to be answered while we address the needs of businesses. As most of you are aware that over this year we have had a plan to create about 3 million jobs, considering the high rate of unemployment in urban areas and of course the high rate of underemployment and unpaid employment in rural areas. We have noted that over the past 8 months within this fiscal year, we have got to about 1.8, 1.9 million jobs, close to 35% of them being temporary jobs with a great possibility that they might get lost. But it's important to see that from now on, it will be very difficult to continue with the same speed and rate of increasing the number of new jobs created. So there is a bit of re-strategization about on how we can continue doing business in terms of supporting micro, small, and medium enterprises, which are the key growth of engine for job creation, on top of additional larger enterprises creating additional jobs. So the next few months, particularly the next 3 months, there will be a great emphasis towards supporting already existing and operating enterprises with a greater essence of making sure that they continue to operate and they continue to retain their current number of employees. We estimate there are about 800,000 micro, small, and medium enterprises. Of course, about 800,000 of them are micro enterprises. But small and medium enterprises, which have sustained several shocks the last couple of years, are the ones that are likely to remain operating well and which require support. But micro enterprises, which also have been established by the credit they have obtained from microfinance institutions, the need for survival of these micro enterprises is quite very important, because any sort of insolvency or bankruptcy in these micro enterprises would also lead to a financial crisis within the microfinance institutions, and for small and medium enterprises, even larger enterprise as well, leading to a financial crisis if many of them become insolvent. So our current focus is, one is primarily to decrease their expense, which is, as earlier being stated, that a considerable number of micro enterprises and small and medium enterprises receive support from the government. And that support includes, very discounted shared rent, and at the same time, availability of land, and of course, several additional technical supports. So there is a good likelihood, we have been in discussion with regional presidents and regional job creation bodies, for small and medium enterprise and micro enterprises, most of the shared rent will be waived, at least for the next 3 to 4 months period. And that would also be, there are also a few decisions under discussion, including postponement of debt payment for many of those who received credit from microfinance institutions. So at least 3 to 4 months period debt postponement, which would lead to a little bit additional finance at the hand of these enterprises, which could further translate into paying salaries of their employees. And there are also additional discussions in terms of availing, offering a sort of an income tax discount, or waiving the income tax that is paid from payroll, and at the same time, other sorts of taxations as well for these businesses. At the end of the day, this is for the survival of the next 3 to 6 months period. But in terms of revival after the 6 months period, which would definitely require additional financing in terms of ensuring there is credit facilities in place, preferably with a quite discounted rate. So these all alternatives are already on the table, and some of them have already got a decision, which are likely to support micro, small, and medium enterprises. I think along with this, there is a need to understand that the impact of any spread of the virus in any community, the majority impact would be by the health system, which is obviously the expenditures in the health system, and also the shortage of several commodities, and of course, several human resource needs that will come along with that. But it's important to understand, as the crisis looms and as the crisis expands, out-of-pocket payments of each family will increase. This out-of-pocket, which is a required payment for each and every household to be able to serve those who are sick in each household. And this will further compound, the requirements, particularly those who are the households which are likely to face this challenge. So economic crisis will end up as a household crisis. And the household crisis requires a great safety net. Ethiopia, even in Africa, has one of the largest safety net programs that caters about 8.5 million people. So in rural areas, this will continue, but at the same time in urban areas, which we already have through the urban safety net program, about 600,000 families benefiting from this. This will expand depending on the number of people, particularly those who are self-employed, who might likely lose income, and also those who are temporarily employed and low-skilled individuals who will succumb to the usual layoff whenever the crisis looms. So expanding the safety net will be the greater opportunity in here. I think finally, I would like to speak about the opportunity that this crisis might avail, which is primarily in the technology side. Even in the most accustomed nations such as China, the older generation had no much use of systems such as Alipay or WeChat Pay. All this have been compelled to use during the lockdown measures. So the users of these important payment mechanisms have incrementally, have exponentially increased. So we are also seeing it in Ethiopia, the pressure to use technology, including electronic payments and electronic, even distance, remote working, remote learning. All these are new avenues that could definitely add additional productivity into the system that we have. And of course, while we have a clear understanding that those enterprises that might face challenge, for example, in textile and garment, who are facing export challenge, are also repurposing their production to producing many of the protective instruments, such as masks, and some of them also producing liquid soap and sanitizers and such. These are opportunities, but it is important that we do not overestimate the opportunities that are availed, because the crisis is quite huge, even though we have the optimism. I see that many people see, okay, because many of the companies are also repurposing production, there will be a lot of income and jobs can be retained. But I'm afraid we might overestimate the impact of these few leeways that we are seeing. But in general, I think the very basic mantra in here is hope for the best, but of course, prepare for the worst. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. I think there's a lot there that I'm not going to try and unpack because I don't want to keep you for too long. But I've heard a lot of very interesting and promising initiatives to come from the government to support private sector, SMEs, and whatnot. So that's a very good direction. I'm going to go to Berhane. You've heard some of the big ideas from the government side. You've also looked at a number of other countries' policy responses. I'm going to ask from a very private sector point of view, since you're the only representative here, at least currently the private sector person. What, if you can pick one or two countries where you've seen very good interventions, where the idea might be promising for Ethiopia to adopt, and what you also think about some of these directions that were mentioned by His Excellency, Dr. Ephraim and Dr. Eob.
Okay, thank you, Henok. I think both of them have mentioned some of the intervention that we've seen in other countries. For example, India, they gave a good example of providing like direct support to the poor, like food items and giving utility bill deferments for 3 months or so, which we thought like was interesting. And I think that, as we heard today, the government is also thinking about that. But the other one, from the African perspective, for Ghana, for example, they have provided special life insurance coverage, for example, for 10,000 health personnel who are in the front line, working on the COVID response to protect their livelihoods, and also working with local charities and faith-based organizations to deliver dry foods and home meals to vulnerable communities, getting the communities involved in supporting the big macro effort that the country is doing. And I know we've seen a lot of funds being collected, maybe through tele or other means, but Ghana has also done a national trust fund where people from all over the world and Ghanaians and the locals can actually put funds in there to support the poor. But from the business side, what we've seen that are interesting is also being mentioned by Dr. Eyob and Dr. Ephraim are, for example, temporary, reducing stamp duty so that can facilitate real estate or other similar transactions, dividend tax reductions, or even capital gains reduction or postponement, so that the activity of the economy continues to happen. Tax payment deferment has been mentioned by them, loan guarantees, and directed support to loans and micro and small medium enterprises. And I think Dr. Ephraim has emphasized the importance of supporting the micro enterprises who are, would be really exposed. So having such kind of loan guarantees or dedicated support to the exposed sectors, I think is what we've seen. And it seems that they are the kind of measures that they are thinking of as well.
Very interesting, very interesting. So, I mean, in sum, it sounds like what we need to do is, while the crisis is lasting, we need to create breathing room so that our enterprises can continue to stay alive, so that when the crisis is over, we need to go back to normal policy, so that the burden on the fiscal policy, on government revenues and reserves is not too much, but allows companies to actually continue on. And therefore, when the crisis, the health crisis is over, then the rebound happens fast. I think that's safe to say the broader picture that we're hearing from the global, from the private sector side, but also the way the Ethiopian government is approaching it. I think that's very good and very promising. Lots of ideas we've heard, and we're a little bit over time already, but I also want to read out a few questions and just read them all out. You can take them down and I will give a chance to whoever wants to respond to them just for the next few minutes. Because I think the amount of questions that are coming are a lot, and a lot of good questions too. Let me start from the last one. I'll just read 4 or 5 questions.
Just before that,
yeah,
because it's likely to close after reading the questions. I just wanted to mention one very important plan that we have as a commission is, even though most of the estimates that we have now are based on assumptions, because data is quite limited, we are now finalizing preparations to conduct phone surveys to selected firms based on randomly selected firms, which can help us to understand the impact of the current crisis on jobs and retention. So assuming that many of the audience on this webinar will be likely people who have enterprises and who have a direct role in such, I would like to just share this idea that please be ready for that. And we'll be following up with a phone survey with many enterprises randomly selected to understand this impact. And this will be a regular survey that we do on 2 months and on 2 weeks and 4 weeks range. In that case, we'll have clarity of what is the actual impact of COVID-19 on these specific firms. Thank you.
That's fantastic. You've heard it all. So private sector out there, I think you're about to be really listened to. So this is a good time to start engaging government. I've been around for many years when the private sector complains of not being listened to. So now the channels are open. Make sure you're following up. So let me go back to some of the questions. Gabriel Negatu, former director at African Development Bank. Very important question about, first of all, he says, thanks to the government of Ethiopia for the leadership in addressing this crisis. And then he goes on to say the COVID crisis is coming on the back of a major locust invasion of the region. What is being done to ensure there is no food shortage in the next few months, as we have no longer a capacity to import? I think very critical question. Dr. Eleni from Blue Moon, I think some of the questions are essentially answered. Additional question, what about local manufacturing as a response to COVID-19, like production of personal protective equipment that can replace imports? I think this has been touched upon as well. Paul Reynolds from Inchcape, Moenko, given the depreciation of agri-exporting countries' currencies, what will be the impact on Ethiopia's export competitiveness? Very important question, I think more for Eyo. And what measures could be taken to address that? Let me, Ato Taddesa Talahun from National Oil. The government should support the private sector to mitigate the negative impact of COVID-19 on business through corporate tax redirection or forex provision to essential goods. I think most of this has been answered, but the question of foreign currency allocation, again, I hear much complaint from the private sector, even people who are in line for uptake of foreign currency who a year or 6 months they've been waiting for foreign currency, but now the demand is more on essential goods, medical equipment, food. They are not able to switch their LCs, and this is because the system is not very flexible, obviously for reasons of managing the shortage of the foreign currency. But it is an issue that's coming up because some are saying, look, economy is going to be slowed down, no point bringing in furniture, maybe I should be allowed to bring in packaged food or ventilators for the hospitals. So this is a question that's coming back up. Let me take one more question and I will come back to you. I think most have been answered directly. Let me come back to you, and if we have more time, I'll allow more questions to be asked. But I'm going to let you pick the questions to answer to. First, let's start with Dr. Eyo.
Thank you so much. I think these are very, very good questions. You said on the food shortage, as I mentioned early on, we actually have a very generous estimated package. When we estimated about 1.6 billion spending the next 3 months, the health expenditure is about 430 million. The rest goes to emergency needs, including food. And we'll be using the food stock that we have in the emergency stores, but also mobilizing additional amount of resource. So I want to reassure the public that enough food stock is available for the next 2-3 months, and we're working on additional purchase if the crisis continues. But also, one thing very important to note is, as part of this protocol I mentioned early on, one thing we have to reassure is that the supply chain is intact, that food products are coming from rural areas to the urban areas, and the role of cooperative is absolutely critical in this regard, and they are being empowered. And with this protocol, there will not be any disruption of the food supply chain. But that is really the most important area of focus. We have to make sure nobody dies of starvation while we're trying to fight the pandemic, and we have all our eyes on that. On local manufacturing, maybe Dr. Ephraim can add, but Ministry of Trade and Industry is working on this full time. I mean, their focus is on how we can support local manufacturers so that they can shift to other important supplies. And in that regard, identifying some of their inputs, providing them with needed government support, including liquidity, is something that the ministry is working on. On export competitiveness, I guess, as I said early on, the timing is too bad because we've seen significant improvement on our competitiveness overall because exports were peaking. But this is a major setback, and as part of, I think, the rebound, will continue to reform. Part of our lack of export competitiveness relates to our forex regime, and that reform, as I said, will continue with full force. And when we emerge out of this crisis, we would have addressed most of the distortions that are eating into our competitiveness. Another important thing is productivity, and as I mentioned earlier on, we're working on agriculture productivity in general. On private sector, again, the most important thing is, again, to have this sense of shared responsibility. And our approach is this. The government cannot do this alone. Whatever the private sector does, we need to be supportive of that, and we need to encourage that. For instance, when we talk about food banks and food distribution, there are very encouraging initiatives, including from Totades was that question on how the private sector can help in feeding a certain segment of society rather than just giving cash. This is very much welcome. We've already seen this in some regions, but even across the nation, including Addis, this will be something that we would encourage the private sector to support certain amount of people that need to be fed, using their warehouses, using some of their facilities that are not in use currently because of the slowdown. But on Forex allocation, one of the major policy initiatives the government has announced is to create that flexibility for banks to allow their customers to ship their orders. If the banks are not really responding to that, it's something we need to check. But generally, I know banks have been very responsive to this. Some banks, in fact, have completely reduced the fee that they charge for LC extension to near zero at times. So we need to take this with a grain of salt. The banks are I think, doing something good, but if they need to do more, it's something to watch and advise.
Okay, thank you. I could be a step behind the curve in that sense, if the problem has been addressed. So the complaints I've heard was from a couple of weeks ago, and things are moving very quickly. I guess that's a good thing. Dr. Ephraim, do you want to chime in on some of the questions? Or you could also make your last closing remarks.
Yeah, and I think specific questions I have already addressed them, particular into the support required for small and medium enterprises and also larger enterprises in terms of making sure that they retain their employees over the next several months. But I think it's very important for all of us to think this crisis into not just a short period of time crisis, even though as a nation we're preparing for a maximum of, we can contain this in 3 months period. But at the same time, there is a good possibility that it could go as high as 6 months period if it does not linger more than that. So for any policymaker, one critical item, and for many of the private sector actors, is this crisis requires an action that is particularly delineated into a survival period where the next 3 to 6 months will be the focus, followed by a revival period where we get everyone back to jobs, where we make sure many of the enterprise that have been operating or hibernating or operating at a very minimum level will go back to resume their specific level of engagement. And but one another thing is that earlier Berhane also mentioned it about the possibility of decrease in remittance at the national level, which would definitely also impact our imports, which would also further affect our local manufacturing, because many of our remittance, which is also the great source of foreign currency that used to come from the US, Europe, and the Middle East, because many of Ethiopians who live abroad are heavily dependent on service sectors globally. And now that we know hotel, tourism, and service sector is highly affected at a global level, there is a very good likelihood that remittance will decrease, which would affect our forex reserve and further in turn affecting also our import on manufacturing. So we are eyeing a situation whereby there is so much hope to go out of it over the next 6 months period, but it could also end up becoming a cycle of crisis affecting jobs, income, and household level impact as well. Thank you.
On that increased positive take from the government side, let me come to you, Berhane. So closing words, but your industry is obviously being affected tremendously. Some of the questions were in fact to that effect. Any parting advice to private sector? How do we cope? What are some of the actions that you recommend businesses take to stay afloat and contribute to the national rebounding, and perhaps even join hands with the government in terms of jointly attacking this crisis? This is a crisis of all humanity. There's also a crisis of all Ethiopians. this is an opportunity to unite private sector and public sector and every single Ethiopian. Any last comments or advice to that effect?
As you said, businesses are currently under a lot of pressure at the moment. And then for us at CFIUS, investing in businesses here in Ethiopia have been, this has been one of the main conversations that we've been having with a lot of entrepreneurs on how to cope and recover and move on. So one of the things, I think one of the foremost things I would say is, and to, like you said, working together with the government is to really first protect your employees by providing safe environment, the required PPE, making operational rearrangements to manage the spread of the virus within the business is very, very critical at the moment. And this is really a message to say, it's time to really take care of the employees so that they're not exposed to the coronavirus spread. The second advice would be, cash is king. So following strict cash flow planning, operational cost management, for example, holding off on non-critical expenditures and supply chain repositioning is very critical to withstand the current impact. And the last but not least is really finding ways on how to innovate and adapt to changing market conditions, especially for the next 3 months, to keep afloat your businesses. So that's the kind of thoughts I would have on this.
Fantastic. I think they're all excellent points to be made at this point. And I hope all the business people out there are planning, as Dr. Ephraim said, hoping for the best, but planning to be able to take advantage of some of the opportunities, but also staying afloat. Any last comments from you, Excellency Dr. Eyob? Maybe sure. Closing words. One question, Zagito Derasan, is actually on the question of oil prices. And I was asking about this. China does have enough money to start paying when prices are so low like now. Any plans on taking advantage of that at all? Or
sure, absolutely. On that question, we're definitely trying. In fact, I've started procuring any amount of oil that we can store. We don't have big storage facilities, unfortunately, but whatever storage we have is going to be filled for sure. But on last comments, I think I want to say two things. First of all this prediction and hinge on whether we can collectively minimize the spread of this virus. I mean, if you look at epidemiological predictions, if you follow the Italian curve or the Chinese curve or the US curve, things are very, very worrisome. We have to make sure that the spread of this virus is as minimal as possible, because if you do that, then first of all, our healthcare system will be intact. We're not going to overwhelm it. And also our response would be much focused on protecting livelihoods that are already affected. But if it goes out of control, this is going to be very, very difficult. So as such, as Brane mentioned earlier on, I urge everyone to take all precautionary measures and to take this as a serious health and economic hazard and do everything in their power to minimize the impact. And secondly, again, for the private sector as well, this is not a time to maximize profits. It's a time to minimize losses, collective losses, not even firm level losses. So this sense of humanity, this sense of shared responsibility has to continue so that we can quickly come out of this crisis and continue our path to prosperity, which I'm sure is a likely scenario. Thank you.
Excellent closing points, and I think it's important to focus on making sure the health crisis is contained. And I really applaud your leadership. It's very seldom that I feel so satisfied with everybody on the panel. I think you guys have been a fantastic panel. I think we have a very big audience. On top of this, there's about 500 people watching the stream, the live stream on YouTube as well. It tells you the amount of needs and for information and guidance and clarity out there. And I think this panel has provided quite a lot of it. I have one final question I can't refuse for Dr. Eyob. And this is a very important national project, the Great Renaissance Dam. The question is, will we be able to keep up the pace with the GERD to start filling in the coming rainy season? I promise I won't ask any more questions.
Sure. Look, we might reprioritize the projects because of this crisis, but GERD, I assure you, is not one of that. This is a national, I think, pride for all of us to make sure this project is completed in time. And as we speak, activity is ongoing. And if there is any disbursement that I would happily sign off, is the disbursement that comes as a request from EP for GERD. So rest assured, we're going to keep the timeline and we'll fill the dam and start generating power with the timeline.
I can hear everybody in the audience also clapping. So thank you so much, Dr. Eyob. Thank you so much, Dr. Ephraim, Abeba, and Berhane. I think this has been a wonderful conversation. We'll have follow-ons to start looking at the specific sectors and other areas of concern for our country. I am sure everybody in the audience would have clapped, and this would have been a very loud clap indeed, because we really have a lot of clarity. I would also like to thank one more time the staff of the Precise Consult, the staff of Flawless Events that have been managing the technology behind this, and also that of 251 and Gazebo International, who have come together to put this thing together. So thank you so much to you guys. Thank you for everybody that has been tuning in. I know there are some questions that have not been answered, but if there are burning and that have to be answered, we promise to go back to our panelists and ask them to answer in writing. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day, evening, wherever you are.
Thank you, Henok.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.